Welcome to IB Unplugged, a Cognity podcast for IBDP educators that tackles your submitted challenges and questions by connecting you with experts and peers who share their ideas and stories from real classrooms. Whether you're a seasoned educator or new to the IB world, each biweekly episode and guest aims to equip you with practical tips and positive inspiration, helping you teach with more confidence, creativity, and joy. So whether you're walking your dog or commuting to school, hit play and join a community of educators ready to learn, laugh, and thrive in your IB journey.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of IB Unplugged. We're your co-hosts, Courtney and John. And today we have the pleasure of meeting with Damien Vassallo to talk about blended learning.
Damien Vassallo is a passionate educator, school leader with over 20 years of experience in global education and school transformation. He's all about reflective learning. And just this last year, he was the founding headmaster of Intare Louisen-Lund School in Nyamata, Rwanda. Before coming to Rwanda, he was a DP coordinator, dean of student life, director of global education, classroom teacher in Germany at the Stiftung Louisen-Lund and Landheim in Ammersee. But this guy, he's got so much experience and so much interest in terms of what we can do to create true blended learning environments in our classrooms across IB programs, not just DP, but also in MYP as well. His interests are primarily within inquiry-based learning, cooperative learning, metacognition, creative and effective blending learning environments, and effectively just harnessing the power of digital technology to promote learner autonomy and personalization in education. And this was definitely focus of our conversation today. You're going to have so many sort of gold nuggets that come out for you on this one. But for me, one of the things that really stuck out was this concept of like, as a teacher in the classroom, you tend to think like, because I've scaffolded this and because I'm controlling the pacing of the learning here, I know what has been learned and therefore it's really effective. And I think sometimes as teachers, we get quite fearful of trying different systems because we feel like we're going to lose some control. But what became very, very clear is that it's far more effective for young people. They feel like they're getting a lot more out of it. They feel like because that autonomy exists, because the blending learning is there with a coach on the side, they're actually getting so much more from their educational journey. And it was really inspirational for me in that regard.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think when you're talking to him, you can tell how passionate he is about this concept of blended learning and how he really believes in the model that he's been able to, one, kick off in his previous school and now really develop as the core model of the school that he's now founded. And I think there were two things that stood out to me. One was definitely in his leadership style, where I loved that he kept acknowledging like, yeah, it didn't go perfectly the first time we did this. There's been so much iteration on the model of, I learned this, we evolved it this way. We figured out this didn't work, so we changed it. And I really like that openness and vulnerability of, we're doing something really bold, which means that there's more risk of either small failures or big ones. And but that doesn't discourage me or my school from still really revolutionizing the way that we develop our curriculum. And so I really liked that about the way that he was describing what he was doing. And then I also, you'll all find out soon that one really big part of the way that his blended learning model works is through studio time. And I love this kind of middle space where, like he said, it's not flipped learning, it's blended learning. And so these studios are not study halls or just places to do homework in a school, but really it is something quite different. So I think listeners will appreciate learning about the studio time as well.
Definitely. So regardless of if you're in a school that can be innovative and completely shift things around and create studio time and all this, or if you're in a classroom where it's kind of rigidly structured by the timetable, there's still going to be a lot of really powerful stuff in this episode for you. So we hope you enjoy the show.
Hi, Damien. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure and privilege.
It's a pleasure and privilege for us. So what we want to get started with is our classic warm-up question, which is why did you choose a career in education?
I often feel like my career in education chose me, actually. I was just like most kids, born with a natural curiosity, an intellectual curiosity to explore the world around me. And so I've always had a love of learning, a love of school. And there was always a part of me that wanted to share that with other people, especially with younger people, to kind of transfer that passion of learning to them. So my parents say when I was when I was a younger child and I would get interested in something, it would almost become obsessive, that I would kind of dive into my own line of inquiry and lose myself in it. And I think that that's true. And so for me, leaving school and later leaving university was such a hard move for me. I wanted to be in a context in which learning was very intentional and very deliberate, even though I always tell my students we learn not for school, we learn for life. But for me, it was the scholastic context was where I felt most at home and where I felt I could most reach other people to transfer that passion for learning.
I love that. That's sort of embodying a lifelong learner and wanting to make sure that other people can see the benefits of that as well.
Exactly.
And of course, then that led to, now founding a school and pushing things forward in this direction with kind of a new curricula. It's really exciting. So thinking about the future then, what's coming up for the role of educators? What's in our future?
When we give an answer to this question, we run the risk of being quite cliche, because often people will say, the new role of the teacher is to be more of a learning coach rather than someone who transmits knowledge or wisdom to students.
So kind of everything that I've been saying so far.
Yeah, I would really actually affirm that and say that's exactly right. I mean, when Alison King said back in the 1990s that teachers needed to move from a teacher-centered approach to instruction to a learner-centered approach to instruction, and she coined those terms, the move from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side to the meddler in the middle. I think that's exactly true, but I think people are so tired of hearing about it that I would try to look at it from another angle and say the educators of the 21st century need to be facilitators of inquiry, not just facilitators of learning, but really facilitating inquiry. And to facilitate inquiry properly, I think that they also have to be metacognitive coaches. So the role of teachers has moved from this more purely cognitive level to a metacognitive and strategic level. How do we teach learners to approach their learning in ways that will be effective and will optimize outcomes for them? How do we instill in them motivation throughout these learning processes and keep that spark of intellectual curiosity that they're born with alive through adolescence and into adulthood, and to fan the flames of lifelong learning, as you said before. So for me, teachers in the 21st century will be facilitators of inquiry, and they'll be metacognitive coaches who promote reflective learning.
Nice. And I think you can see that reflected in many schools who are really adopting more of like a coaching concept, right? And a lot of people are going through professional development where they're trying to increase the amount of coaching capabilities of people on their staff and the teachers and all the way through the whole program. So yeah, I think that's in line with what we're seeing in different schools.
That's a problem for a lot of teachers, is that shift in their role. And I think school leaders need to respond by giving them the tools that they need and the professional development that they need to feel comfortable with that new role. Because for a long time, we will have teachers who were trained for a different type of role and were not trained to be the kind of 21st century educators that I'm talking about. So we have to realize that that's a real concern and a real need. And we also have to look at how we're educating younger teachers. And so that's something that my school is also looking to do, to bring in student teachers and help universities really prepare them to be the educators of the future who fulfill that kind of role that I talked about.
Yeah, and I think that's probably even relevant even if you did like your teacher training or something like that in the 21st century. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have those particular skills and that approachability as a coach, as a teacher. You may have still been taught how to teach with an old style of teaching method. So it's shifting that even if you did that training in the last 10 to 20 years.
Absolutely. I mean, I hate to say it, but I think teacher training is mostly on a global scale still inadequate in terms of preparing teachers to promote good inquiry and to promote metacognitive approaches to learning that develop the students' reflective learning skills.
Yeah. Is this the first year that you have not been teaching in the classroom, or were in your previous school?
No, actually, at my previous school, I was a principal of the IB World School and also a DP coordinator for a long time, and I always kept my teaching role in those positions. And in my final year, I moved on to become the pedagogical head of the school, so the director of educational programs. And in that role, I didn't teach consistently. I did jump in and cover certain classes, and I helped with revision sessions for the DP exams. But I wasn't teaching that year, and that was something that I really missed. So this is the first year that I've really not been a teacher in my role, but I see myself very much still as a teacher and an educator, and so it's important that I take part in learning experiences on campus as much as I can.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that that's essential to be able to still feel connected and grounded into the classrooms, even if you're not necessarily teaching the...
Absolutely. But I'm, pretty fresh from being detached from that. So 23 years in the classroom. Yeah, definitely. Did you feel like there was like a real switch, like you were talking about, of moving from this educator at the front of the classroom to more of that coaching style? Was that something that you feel like you were always doing, or something that you really remember having this deliberate change in how you were teaching? Courtney, I really like that question, because for me, that was a very, very hard shift. So when I started teaching, I was very, very inclined to lecture. I liked giving very dynamic lectures, and probably liked hearing the sound of my own voice too much. And so it was really difficult for me as I went through my teacher training and did professional development to have to kind of relinquish that role and see that that role was not reaching my students in the way that I had hoped that it would. And it didn't matter how dynamic or interesting my lectures were, or at least how dynamic and interesting I thought they were not activating our learners in the way that they should be activated to become real inquirers and critical thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
So when I interact with teachers who have trouble shifting toward a more learner-centered pedagogy, for me it's easy to empathize with them and to say, I know what it's like, and I know how hard it is to give away your stage, but it's not about you, it's about what leads to the best possible learning outcomes for your students.
Yeah.
Ooh. That's heavy. And it's good though, because I think that's true for any educator. I think any educator has that sort of control sense and has that idea of like, I can dictate what's going to happen in the classroom, and they're going to learn stuff because I've covered it and I've said it. And exactly as you said, relinquishing that control and recognizing that there's more learning that can happen, I think is a difficult thing for any educator. Doesn't matter how you've been trained. I think that's a difficult thing to go through. So I'm glad you've brought that up. It's making me reflect and just go, yep, I need to probably think a little bit better about how often I'm planning a learner-centered plan for my lessons, and how often I'm doing a teacher-centered, lesson plan.
Yeah, absolutely, John. If I could just comment on one thing you said, there's this idea that because I said it, I've covered that content and that learning goal is met. And the reality is, just because we've said it doesn't mean the learning goal is met. We've said it and we feel good about ourselves that we've covered that aspect of the curriculum, but that doesn't mean it's arrived in the students' minds. So that's really important. And more importantly, doesn't mean that the students can apply it to relevant context.
Right.
No, makes a lot of sense. And I think that it leads quite naturally into the big topic of our episode, which is on blended learning and true blended learning in the IB. And I think really focusing on this learner-centered model. I want to start first off with just having a bit of a brief overview for some of the teachers and people who are listening that might not feel like they have a complete understanding of, if you could just define blended learning, how would you give context for this?
Sure. To define blended learning, I'm going to take a really simple definition that I like, and that's a definition that I've heard from Michael Horn, who's an educator, an educational theorist who has really inspired me to help, and he doesn't know that, to help develop this pedagogy for my schools, but he might know it after this podcast. And Michael Horn basically says blended learning, put simply, is a combination of online learning with a physical learning environment, or what he calls a bricks and mortar school. And what we're trying to do in blended learning is to harness and capitalize on the benefits of those two approaches. So, for example, online learning can facilitate personalization by allowing students to determine the pace of their learning. and also to determine the path, to slow the learning down, to rewind and repeat and take their own time, or to move forward where they don't need that extra time. So online learning has that advantage. The physical learning environment or the face-to-face learning environment has the advantage that we're in a learning community. So we have access to peers and to teachers who are experts in different ways, and we can co-construct knowledge and understanding together with them, get support from them. But also, and I think this is even more key, in the physical learning environment, you develop a lot of those skills that are so important, like social and communication skills, being able to work on in a team, being able to collaborate effectively, and those come up short in a purely online learning environment. So blended learning environment is kind of the optimal approach to promote the kind of learning that's lasting and that has the most impact on students.
Does this help me out structurally with this just a little bit? So is this like am I using like an ed tech tool, like Cognity, for example, might facilitate some of the things that I'm doing, and then I'm also there as physical, or is it almost like a full online course, right? Where it's like, here's your platform where you're submitting assignments. Here's your platform where you're kind of following things through. Almost like, I think many educators out there who are listening have probably done some form of online learning. Is it that style, or is it kind of still under the full facilitation of the teacher? They're just using ed tech platforms to kind of support their direction in the school?
I think that's a difficult question to answer in terms of that contrast. I mean, maybe I'll explain what it looks like in our school for that to be helpful for you to understand what we're talking about. So I think, yes, the platform, the learning management system is key, combined with some ed tech software like Cognity. And my previous school where we started this uses Cognity. In fact, it's our main ed tech tool after the learning management system. So almost all of the learning resources are available to students online, and all of their tasks are there as well. But all of this online learning takes place at school. And I think that is completely unique for the concept that we're talking about. In a way, it's a blended learning environment, but it's not the flipped classroom in the sense that we send them home and they do the part of online learning away from the school and away from the teacher. It's completely blended, so that when they're doing their online learning, they're actually at school and they're always in the presence of educators and their peers, so that they can draw on their experience and their support. I would also add that in our blended learning environment, it's not just about the digital or online learning space and the physical classroom. It's also much more. It's about all of the learning experiences that take place outside of the classroom on the broader campus that we would call co-curricular and residential, and also the experiences that go beyond the campus into the community. So the blended and learning environment here has many concentric circles and encompasses, and not only that very, very close and personal, intimate world of the student's laptop tablet, where they have access to the learning management system, not only the classroom, but also all of those realms of experience and those learning environments beyond the classroom that are perhaps more effective than the classroom.
So I guess it sounds like it has the potential to bring in all the different competencies that a student might express in different facets of their educational journey, not just what you're seeing in the classroom, but kind of everywhere else as well.
Absolutely. And connecting learning with the community is so important because, as I said, the old motto of the first school that I had a full-time job as a teacher at, we learn not for school, but for life, coined by Seneca. It's so real and so true. And so we have to make our schools look more like the world beyond the campus. And we also have to allow students to engage directly with the community beyond the campus from the youngest age possible, so that they're prepared for that world beyond the academy.
Today's CogTip is submitted by Laura Nickstad from the Sumner Academy of Arts and Science. Laura says, I've just started using Cognity to support the internal assessment in chemistry. I appreciate the IA resources and the tools sections, as there's a wide variety of options so that students doing vastly different IAs can all use and make the most out of Cognity as a resource. I know in your new school, the DP you're going to be launching coming up, but and the school just opened. It was last year, right? So we're not even 1 year in, right?
That's right. For the school I'm currently head of, the founding headmaster, we're not even 1 year in. But we're doing this approach to learning already.
Yeah, you might have learned a few things this year, might have figured out a lot as you go along. And I'm wondering if someone like me or John, somebody came into the school, what do you think would be most surprising or most interesting about the way that you've set up your new school?
So thank you. That's a really good question, Courtney. I think the most obvious difference that an observer would notice when coming to our school from other schools would be studio time. And studio time is a term that a colleague and I created after we attended the NIAS conference in 2019, which was called Design for Learning, and where we met Michael Horn and heard his talk about disruptive innovation and creating a blended learning environment at your school. We were so impacted that we thought we can't just go home and say what a great idea and do nothing about it, but we have to do something about it. And so because we had talked so much about design for learning, we thought of the design studio as a great kind of context or metaphor for a learning environment. And we decided to create a flexible, open learning space with different zones that accommodate different approaches to learning. So a quiet area for independent work, a comfortable reader's corner where students can sit on comfortable chairs and not use their digital devices and pick up a book and read or a magazine. More collaborative areas where students can work on projects together if they choose to work with their peers. And so what you would see if you came into either the school I work at now or the school I helped to develop over the past 11 years, you would see these flexible open learning spaces that we call learning studios, and you would see students engaged in studio time. And studio time for us is the home of self-directed learning. And we felt we couldn't promote true self-directed learning and student autonomy and agency if we didn't create a learning environment in which that was possible. And so having these flexible learning spaces where students are in control, but where teachers are present, and they're not only to support students if they need help, but also to be their kind of metacognitive coaches throughout the process, actively monitoring what the students are doing and actively guiding them strategically through the learning process. This was really the most revolutionary change that happened at our school.
Talk to me about how that fits within, like, I'm kind of, I guess, old school in my thinking right now with regard to like, okay, there's a timetable. And how does this kind of fit within timetables, seminars? How does studio time kind of sit there? Because many schools, I think, can be governed by their timetable as opposed to the other way around. How does that look in your school? What does that actually kind of manifest as?
This is a great question because, the design for learning approach took us deeply into design thinking. And so when we were ideating and prototyping about how a blended learning model could look in which students had real agency and how we could incorporate studio time into our regular schedule, we actually started prototyping directly by creating a kind of timetable. How could this look within the framework of the timetable as we know it, and where could we place it? And so essentially, and this was in a school that did not yet have the MYP, so we were working with the DP directly. And as you know, in the DP, you have to make sure that students have a certain number of hours of instruction in each of their subjects. So this was something we had to think about, and we knew we couldn't really accommodate studio time into that schedule and still maintain that if studio time had nothing to do with that. And that's where this idea, I think, comes from, that instead of the traditional flipped classroom, which I guess is a progressive approach, but it's quite old now, and I don't think it's very, very effective, in which children are sent home and they do their online learning at home, or they do their online learning completely independently. We thought, let's bring in teachers from all of the subject areas, put them into studio time, and then that can be considered instructional time in their particular subject within the DP, but the students would be in control of when they were actually engaging with that subject and for how long at that time. Of course, the total time would be monitored by their teachers. So to get back to your question, why don't I take you through our kind of inverted classroom model so you can better understand it. So students would go to what we call a seminar at the beginning of a unit or a learning sequence. And this would be this face-to-face classroom that looks like classes in other schools. So this would not be unfamiliar. And they would get a unit introduction in which we made quite transparent what are the learning goals of this topic, what are the concepts that we're going to be focusing on, what criteria will measure your learning and see if you've reached those learning outcomes, and what texts and topics will we be working with through this, so that everything is transparent right at the outset of the unit or learning sequence. The students know the end goal, they know how they'll be judged on that. And that's done in presence with their subject teacher, so that if they have any questions, they can be cleared up right at the start of the unit. It's kind of like backward planning, but for students. Like, we often do this backward planning for our instructional design, and we start with the end of the unit, where we want them to be, the end product, the learning outcome, and the impact. So students know that's where I need to go, and this is the way we're going to be going. And then after that, we release them into studio time with the online learning tools that they have. So with the learning management system, and also with EdTech tools like Cognity, and tasks and assignments and resources. And what they do in the first part of studio time within a learning sequence is they acquire basic knowledge and understanding in that particular topic or conceptual area for the unit. So what you're seeing there is the two lower tiers of Bloom's taxonomy. You know, they are recalling, remembering, defining, and they are also understanding on a basic level. So that by the time they come to class, and this is very much in the spirit of the flipped classroom, they already know quite a bit about the topic. And so we maximize on that time together with the teacher to move into the next two tiers of Bloom's taxonomy, where they deepen learning, where they apply and where they analyze. And that happens in the seminar. But I want to say something about seminars at our school that may be different from classes at other schools. They are certainly teacher-led, but they're very, very learner-centered, and cooperative learning is the main approach. So sometimes we will do project-based learning and cooperative learning, but there's always cooperative learning in those sessions, and that makes up the majority of that hour that they're in their seminar. So it is definitely still a student-centered learning experience, although it's teacher-led, teacher-facilitated, and guided, unlike studio time. And once they've then deepened their understanding through analysis and application, they go back into the learning studio. And that's where this top tier of Bloom's occurs, where they create, where they evaluate, where they really apply what they've learned to other contexts and become the designers that they're meant to be, the inquirers and the researchers that they're meant to be. And that can occur on a formative or a summative level. So they could be doing something that would prepare them to approach an IA, a kind of a practice exercise and inquiry, or they could be working on their IAs themselves. So that's how that works. Then there's an assessment, and then that cycle starts up again. Now, in terms of their timetable, what they're actually doing is week for week, we have blocks of time where they don't have seminars. So there's part of their schedule that we design as educators. That's where we place their seminars based on the courses that they've chosen in the DP or the courses that they're taking in the MYP. And then there are these other blocks that account for probably a third of their academic day in the middle years program, and nearly half of their academic day in the diploma program. That's where studio time is. That's where the kids decide what subject I'm gonna work on when, etc. And they actually enter that into the timetabling software. Now, most timetabling softwares don't accommodate that, so we've had to work with providers to design the software in such a way as it accommodates that model. And what students will do is they will actually, on a drop-down tab, they will select the subject that they're working on in that particular framework, and when they switch to work on another subject, they'll select that again. So all of the times that they're working on that subject are recorded. Now, people might raise the objection, from the DP perspective, does that really count as the students' hours for the course? And the IB's answer to us at our school, the first school that I introduced this concept to, where the DP has been running for 15 years, They have said yes, if you have teachers present. How you conceive of those instructional periods is up to you. And so I really respect the IB for that. I actually had a conversation with one of the director generals about that, and she thought it was a great idea. And the visitors have confirmed that they love this idea of studio time, and they feel that it fits squarely within IB pedagogy. Sorry, that response was rather long, but
no, it's so cool. You can see how it would work. Obviously, I can tell where you've had to kind of justify a lot of this before, but it's very clear how this fits within the IB framework. And I think across all the different programs themselves, right? You can see how this would work within DP. I mean, obviously, if you're going to start off with a seminar, I imagine it allows great framing of something like an interdisciplinary unit. Or does that even exist then? Because it sounds like everything's kind of interdisciplinary. If you're presenting a seminar the way that you've described, I mean, my imagination's going right now, so maybe help me out if this is incorrect or not. But you would maybe highlight a problem or a sort of bigger concept that can then be unpacked in the different disciplines that students have selected. Is that kind of the right thing that's going on?
Absolutely. Well, let me say at the outset, in responding to that question, we still have IDUs, interdisciplinary units are a requirement in the MYP, and we still do them. In the DP, we don't have them explicitly in my previous school, and we don't have the DP yet at this school. But interdisciplinary learning is a priority, and studio time is actually a real opportunity for that, because you have subject teachers from other subject areas or subject groups present to help you make those connections as they are coaching you metacognitively through your learning processes. But certainly we also try to do it within the seminars. I'd like to pick up on this idea of why I think that this model is so compatible with an IB curriculum, regardless of which program we're talking about. All of the programs center around inquiry. Questions are the basis for all learning in our human experience. We start to ask ourselves questions when we're young, and other people ask us questions about the world around us. And the IB's pedagogy is grounded in inquiry. In fact, as we plan units, we see that we have to come up with inquiry questions or previously statements of inquiry that were required, and still are in the MYP. And what we see there is that this approach to learning facilitates inquiry because it gives students room to approach these questions. And to approach them in a very, very personalized and individualized way, in a way that sitting in a classroom with direct instruction doesn't. Because then, in most cases, the teacher is the only one asking the question, and the students have very, very little time to pursue answers to the questions that are most interesting to them. And so, having studio time and having other formats like that encourage guided and free inquiry and personalized inquiry are so important for IB pedagogy. When we talk about design thinking as the basis for us creating this model, the first phase of design thinking is empathize. Listen to your students. Listen to what their concerns are and their needs are. And if we're going to talk about the DP, where most teachers would have a concern about this high level of autonomy and agency because they say there's all this pressure to deliver my curriculum and there's a lot of content and there's exams at the end, I would say to them, my students were saying, in the DP, we have no time to do all this inquiry-based learning that the IB expects of us. Of course, they didn't formulate it like that. They said, I don't have time for my IAs. I don't have time for my extended essay. I don't have time for my TOK exhibition because I have to sit in class all day listening to my teacher deliver the same content for all of us, even though we're all very different as learners and we're all in different places and we all have different priorities. So please, Mr. Damien, give me a forum in which I can actually get my IAs and my extended essay done, in which I can do inquiry. And that forum for us was studio time. Studio time was the answer. And they said to us, this was the best thing that happened to us in DP2, is that we actually had time to work on these things.
Kind of stop letting this teacher interrupt my learning, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Which sadly is often true.
Yeah. Yeah. How often did you have to intervene with studio time? Because like you said, you have all these teachers and I guess the students are choosing the proportions of their time, and you have this one teacher who maybe like none of the students are spending enough time working on their class? Like, how often did you have to guide students versus letting them handle it on their own?
Yeah, I think we made some mistakes at the beginning, and this is part of the big learning, but it's also part of this idea of scaffolding learning, right? So if you do something like this, you're going to have a really solid instructional design and a really solid support structure from teachers. That includes student subject teachers. It also includes those subject teachers who are in the learning studio, and it includes mentoring. And so our school has a very, very extensive mentoring system in which each student is assigned to a teacher who is their mentor. It's very, very similar to an academic, but I would also say a co-curricular advisor. And these mentors meet with the students on a weekly basis. At both of my schools, my present school, my previous school, this happens on Monday morning every week in the first hour of the school week. And at my present school, we have another block on Thursday morning where it happens. But if that's not enough, we have an extended lunch break where students can always schedule an appointment with their mentors after they eat their lunch or before they eat their lunch. So we have built a lot of time into our schedule for students to meet with their mentors. What the mentor does is they take them through a reflective learning cycle week by week. And that cycle has 3 phases: the planning phase, the monitoring phase, and the evaluation phase. And so part of our intervention is having these mentors who, they're always a subject teacher that has this student in one of their courses, so they know them well. And the mentor is checking in on them across disciplines to make sure that they're keeping up with their learning goals, that they're meeting deadlines, that they're meeting program standards, and they do this on a weekly basis. So the mentor will advise them on how to allocate their studio time. They'll say, I've been noticing on the timetabling software that you're doing a whole lot for English language and literature and not a whole lot for analysis and approaches in mathematics. So you're going to have to adjust this, right? So they're monitoring and tracking the students' hours and the students' engagement in different subjects. But they're also helping them approach their learning more strategically. So part of the planning is looking for learning strategies that can help the students to optimize their learning outcomes. And then they're, as I said, they're monitoring students' hours, but they're also monitoring their progress. And then they're doing reflection with the students together to help them to evaluate not only their achievements and their outcomes, but also the learning process. So what's working, what strategies are working for me, and what strategies are not working for me. That's one of the types of interventions. But we also had to get teachers to be more familiar with their role in studio time. And in our first go at this, I think that they weren't actually prepared for that role. Some of them saw their role as kind of sitting at their desk and doing their email, waiting for students to come to them as if this were a study hall, to use the American nomenclature. And studio time is not study hall, it's course time, so we expect our subject teachers to be actively monitoring as they would in their own classes when students are engaged in learning. And we expect them to be asking students good questions to help facilitate their learning, both from the subject perspective, these cognitive or academic questions, and on this kind of metacognitive or strategic level. And so, yes, we had to intervene several times. I think a classic scene would be I do my walkthrough through studio time, and suddenly all the teachers jump up and start moving around the room and asking questions. But after a while, they got used to this new role, and we had to take the responsibility to also coach them in that new role.
Becoming a better IBDP educator is a daily practice informed through reading, research, personal experience, and episodes from IB Unplugged, like the one you're listening to right now. But sometimes the show can go a bit too quickly, or we simply forget some of the key points once we're out of the car or back from our walk. So to revisit the content in a condensed version, you can download the episode summary at cognity.com/IB Unplugged. You'll find useful links to other resources and exciting bits of information that you can use immediately in your daily practice. So now, back to the show.
So you can see where the role of the teacher and the mentor tutor or the mentor kind of help to scaffold that accountability, make sure that students are going through with it. And I especially like what you were talking about with regard to the students evaluating and reflecting on their progress as well. Can I assume, is that kind of what creates a reporting? Like, how do you report on this? How does it get to parents, that sort of thing? Is it mainly a student-driven report then as well?
It's both. So our reports are issued through our learning management system, and students are required in each term to write their own reflection on their progress. And we usually give them some prompts or a framework to do that. So in term 1, they might use the IB Learner Profile, and in term 2, they might use ATL as their framework or a different framework,
cool.
A different reflection model. The other thing is mentors write reports, and we require our mentors to be in touch with parents at the beginning of the school year and at least once throughout the middle of the term. Toward the end of the term, we have parent-teacher conferences where all parents meet with their child's mentor, whether virtually or on site. And so there is a definite open and consistent level of communication between mentors and subject teachers, and also mentors and parents, to make sure students are on track. But I think another key intervention, which is a part of scaffolding in order to promote learner agency and autonomy that's so key, is the quality of the instructional design. So the unit plan, with its tasks, with its resources, has to help lead students toward the outcome. And that means there have to be a lot of milestones or checkpoints along the way where subject teachers and mentors can see the student is progressing. You can't let the 6 or 8 week unit go by without having those checks. And I think that's the same in most conventional schools as well. They'll do some sort of quizzes or have formative assessments that show their students where they're going. But feedback is also key. So feedback from the teachers, mostly over the learning management system, but also in face-to-face interaction on that formative assessment throughout the process or throughout the learning sequence, to make sure they're moving in the right direction toward the goals. And that's a real challenge, because a lot of teachers love being classroom teachers and they love working with students, but that doesn't necessarily make them instructional designers. And one of the requirements at my school is that when you join our team, I ask, are you prepared to be a co-designer of students' learning experiences? Are you prepared to be an instructional designer and to collaborate not just with your colleagues across disciplines and within your subject area, but also with your students, to make sure that your units are giving students the possibility to personalize learning based on their interests within a curricular and conceptual framework.
Mm-hmm. What I like about that is, I think you can easily start thinking like, oh, this blended learning is basically like free reign, right? So you just give the students like, here's the topic and you decide what direction you're going with it. But what you've clarified for me now is like, okay, no, there's still specific milestones. There's still specific checkpoints. You're designing that instruction for them, but you have to do it in a way that allows differentiation. It allows specialization for the students to kind of go on whatever is good for them, instead of just like everybody's going to go down this specific direction. There's still some scaffolding. It still allows autonomy, which I like quite a bit. And I'm glad you touched on that with regard to like hiring teachers, because throughout this conversation, I've been thinking like, to what extent are you looking for subject experts anymore? It sounds like you're mainly looking for coaches and people who can kind of do both. And I guess especially in the diploma program, you would need people who can do both as they get into some of that higher rings of that content, I guess.
Yeah, I think most teachers, as we talked about earlier, they're not trained, at least not thoroughly and extensively, to be these kind of instructional coaches or these facilitators of inquiry in the way that would be optimal. And so we do want subject experts here. I mean, I feel like knowledge and understanding of content within a subject remains important. Conceptual understanding is equally important and often gets forgotten, unfortunately, by teachers and by those subject experts. But I definitely would say we generally hire subject experts, but we hire subject experts who are kind of looking for a new approach to school and who are open to this new role and willing, in the spirit of lifelong learning, to change and to grow as educators, and to say, look, I want to be an instructional coach like you're talking about. I want to be a strategic learning coach. I want to add this to my repertoire and become a more well-rounded teacher. And so we look for that openness, and we also look for some experiences in which the groundwork would be laid for that. But that's a requirement to be willing to be that, and to be willing also to be an instructional designer, because that instructional design is going to be key, and it has to be in place at the start of the learning sequence. In best case, at the start of the term or the start of the school year, for students to be secure and to meet IB program standards within this framework with this high level of autonomy. Mm-hmm. I would argue that the type of scaffolding and the type of support that students get within this model is more extensive and more effective than in the traditional classroom, even though the teachers feel very in control in those teacher-centered direct instructional settings. They're actually not giving the students that kind of support, and there's no time left in the rest of the day to do so. And so if parents have concern about their students having enough structure and enough support within this system of blended learning that promotes so much autonomy, I would say they're actually getting more support, and they're getting more structure, and there are more check-ins than in the classic approach to learning.
If there was a teacher that had that openness and that willingness and said, I really want to do this, but besides joining your school, what kind of advice would you give to them for learning besides maybe, oh yeah, just go back to school yourself? But like, what could you do as a teacher that really wants to evolve into that role?
I mean, there are definitely a few resources that I would recommend for teachers to look at. Resources, I won't name any specifically, but resources in terms of a concept-based curriculum, resources in terms of, diving into inquiry, resources that highlight cooperative learning, resources that talk about the use of digital technology to promote personalization, things like that. And there are good resources out there. But I think primarily it's not good enough for me as a head of school or for a program coordinator to release them with a bunch of resources and say, just learn it. I think we have to do it together as a team. And so I think there has to be a really good in-house and also out-of-house professional development program in place for those teachers. That was one of the big learning outcomes from our first go at this in my previous school, was that we brought the teachers on board, certainly, and made them stakeholders and key stakeholders in this design process of designing this new pedagogical model with us. But we didn't necessarily prepare them well enough for this new role as educators, as facilitators of inquiry, as facilitators of reflective learning. And so one of the things we tried to do better in starting this new school, and that was a real opportunity to recalibrate, was let's bring all the teachers in August. Our school year starts toward the end of September. And let's take 7 weeks. 7 weeks for teacher orientation, for professional development, for collaborative planning. And let's make sure 7 weeks isn't enough, but it's a start. And let's make sure they feel at least somewhat ready.
I think, well, at least in our school, we would do like 1 to 2 weeks.
Oh, okay. So it is a very big difference.
That's a pretty extensive change for sure.
And now, of course, we can't do 7 weeks every year. But we're going to make sure that the onboarding process has at least a couple weeks of this kind of training. And actually, we've done a lot. We've used a learning management system for teachers as well, so that their professional development nuggets or mini units that they go through that are required before they start teaching here, for example, in inquiry-based learning, in reflective learning, in our inverted classroom model. These are all done as the inverted classroom. So the teacher actually learns in the same way as the student. They're given an introduction by me, and then they go into their studio time in their collaborative learning space, and they watch videos and read materials, and then they take a mastery test. And this is, I think, mastery assessment is also a key part of the scaffolding in this blended learning model that I didn't touch on when I was talking about our inverted classroom. At the end of that first phase of learning, where students or teachers are in studio time and they're doing this knowledge acquisition phase, there's a mastery test at the end, and it's usually done through the learning management system in the form of a short multiple choice or fill in the blank quiz. or short answer quiz, which is then uploaded, and whoever is the educator, either the classroom teacher or the PD facilitator for teachers, can see how each individual candidate scored, so they know how they're going to differentiate in their seminar. It also is an added check to make sure they've actually done what they're supposed to do in their own pace and in their own way, but they've done it before they come to the seminar, before they come to class. And so I think it's important that teachers go through that in PD, that they actually try it out themselves before they deliver it for their students.
It's such a cool idea because it takes the theory of what you're doing, put it directly into practice so that you kind of, as you experience it yourself, you recognize what works well, what doesn't, what you need to adjust for your students as well. But Damien, this is super interesting stuff and really inspiring as well. Like even, I know, for example, in my context, we don't have studio time, we don't have those seminars, but I can see ways in which I could start to incorporate this into my own classroom. This sort of, blended learning approach where it's not just flipped, because actually it's far more than flipped, isn't it? It's putting all the stuff right in the room itself. And this has been really inspiring for me as an educator to think of like, here are some ways that I can actually take a step forward, still accomplish all the things I need to do as a DP educator, and yet make it far more personalized and far more effective for young people as well. And I loved what you commented on earlier about like, the teacher feels like we've got control because we have scaffolded exactly when things are going to happen, and therefore I can say I've said it, and therefore they know it, and we've done it. But as you mentioned, it's actually far less effective than what you're proposing here, because students are far more autonomous. They're designing it together with the teacher. Just super, super inspiring, really cool work that you're doing. Thanks so much for sharing it with all of us. This has been great.
Thank you very much, John.
Yeah, thank you, Damien. I think all of it's been super interesting for me too. And I think that one thing that I also was thinking about is we at Cognity, we feel like when teachers are doing these flipped learning models, it's like, oh yeah, like our product is really great for that. But then you explain the studio time and I'm like, oh, it's even better for that. Like this is really a really great use case and way of using EdTech tools where it's not just about, oh, well, that's the homework tool. It's like, no, this is part of the class as well, but still getting that individualized, tailored approach.
Exactly. When we were introduced to Cognity, we thought Cognity is the ideal EdTech software for this because it's actually promoting exactly what we want, and it has mastery assessment built into it, and it has pacing built into it, it has feedback built into it, and so it's really ideal for implementing this. And John, I just want to go back to one of the points that you mentioned earlier about how to do this in your own schools, because I can imagine a lot of teachers or even school leaders who are listening to this just find it exasperating. Like, we can't do that within our context. This is going to require a major revamp. I would say start simple. Exactly as you said, what can I do within my own classroom, within this own timetable to create perhaps a studio-like environment in which kids can engage in guided or free inquiry in a more meaningful way. And, when we started, we converted a sailboat storage hall into a learning studio, right? So that we didn't have the ideal spaces originally either. So there's a lot that you can do on a smaller scale that's going to have a huge impact, and teachers shouldn't underestimate that.
Really great stuff. Damien, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us and to clarify what's going on, because this is super inspiring, and I hope every educator who's listening to this is feeling the same way that I am right now. This is great.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Courtney. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and I hope that some of what I've shared today can inspire educators to move forward in promoting that spirit of lifelong learning and inquiry in our students.
IB Unplugged is a Cognity podcast hosted by John Patton and Courtney Marlene and produced by Catalina Gaffney. Be sure to subscribe or follow and share with your fellow IB educators. If you'd like to submit a topic, request, or question, please do so on cognity.com/IB Unplugged. Let's keep the conversation going and support each other in teaching with confidence, creativity, and joy. See you next time.